In today's video, we look into 3 caving stories that went horrifyingly wrong. The last one in particular could have been easily avoided if the person had just followed basic common sense. But first, try making it through the first story. As always, viewer discretion advised. 3 seasoned cavers, John Parker, Leo Sanchez, and Mike Barnes, set out early on a crisp morning, eager to explore a cave nestled deep within the wild terrain, known locally as Black Eagle Cave, was rumored to have unexplored sections, and the trio was determined to map its depths. With years of experience behind them, they were confident in their skills. They had trekked for miles through dense forests and waded across shallow lakes to reach the remote entrance, prepared with ropes, helmets, harnesses, and extra supplies. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of wildlife. Upon reaching the cave, the men entered without hesitation, navigating its narrow passages with practiced ease. Their headlamps illuminated the winding tunnels as they descended deeper into the earth. The cave was challenging but familiar territory, with tight squeezes, jagged rocks, and slippery walls. But this was the kind of environment they thrived in. As they descended into a deeper section of the cave, something unexpected happened. Mike, who was moving down a steep, narrow drop, placed his left foot on what appeared to be a sturdy rock. But as soon as he applied pressure, the rock crumbled beneath him, his leg jammed awkwardly between 2 sharp edges, the fragile rock breaking under his weight and wedging his left leg in place. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, and before he could regain his footing, his other leg slipped down, his body lurching forward. The pain hit immediately. His left leg was twisted unnaturally, and as he tried to stabilize himself, the weight of his body pulled on the trapped leg, stretching the muscles and tendons beyond their limit. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his ankle or knee. It was hard to tell which, but he knew something was broken. His entire lower body was being stretched in opposite directions, the tight confines of the cave pressing in on him. The pain was excruciating, a combination of the sharp agony from the break and the intense tearing sensation, as his muscles strained to keep him from slipping further. He gasped for air, struggling to focus through the pain. Leo and John rushed to his side, but the narrow passage made it difficult for them to reach him directly. The confined space and the unstable rock made every movement perilous. John, the closest to Mike, could see the strain on his friend's face, the agony written in every grimace. Mike's leg was wedged tightly, the rock around it crumbling, and his lower body hung at an unnatural angle. They quickly assessed the situation. The fragile rock was too unstable to pull him free without making things worse. Leo tied a rope around Mike's upper body, securing him to prevent any further slips. They knew they couldn't just yank him out. The break in his leg and the awkward angle would only worsen the injury. Instead, they devised a plan to relieve the pressure. John crawled into the narrow gap beside Mike, wedging himself into the small space to stabilize him. Leo, outside the passage, found a sturdy anchor point and looped a second rope through it. The plan was to use the rope to carefully pull Mike upward, while John helped maneuver his trapped leg free. Every second counted, as Mike's breathing was growing more labored with each passing moment, the pain wearing him down. They began the slow, agonizing process of freeing Mike. Leo applied gentle tension to the rope, lifting Mike's upper body slightly, while John worked to loosen the rocks around his trapped leg. Mike winced with every movement, trying not to scream as the pain shot through his leg. The rock shifted slowly, piece by piece, as John carefully cleared the debris. Finally, the last chunk of rock gave way. Mike's leg was free, but the damage was done. His left ankle was visibly swollen and twisted, and he could barely move it without sharp pain shooting up his leg. They carefully maneuvered him out of the narrow passage and into a larger space, where they could assess his injuries more thoroughly. After that, it took hours, with John and Leo taking turns supporting Mike and guiding him through the tight passages. But they finally emerged from Black Eagle Cave, exhausted but relieved. Mike's leg was broken, but thanks to their quick thinking and careful efforts, he was safe and alive. If you made it through the first story, then gear up for the next one, as it is even more painful to watch. On the morning of 31st August 2015, 4 experienced cavers, Bob Goforth, Mark Panzing, Adam Zipkin, and Mike Van Note, gathered at the entrance of Raspberry Cave in Arizona. Armed with tools, ropes, and headlamps, they were eager to explore the cave's narrow passages, hoping to uncover new chambers or hidden leads. Their goal that day was to dig through mud and rock in hopes of discovering new sections of the cave. After checking their gear and mapping out their plan, they made their way toward the cave entrance. Raspberry Cave, hidden among the rocky basalt terrain, had an entrance barely wide enough to squeeze through. Late in the morning, they squeezed through the cave's narrow entrance, which led them into a small room just large enough to sit in. From there, they descended into a much larger room, with massive boulders precariously wedged into the ceiling above them. At the base of this room was a narrow 10-foot climb down into a smaller chamber, which led to a crawl space about 12 feet long, connecting them to yet another small room. The second small room had a promising lead, so the four men began digging out wet mud and rocks, passing the debris back through the tight crawl space to be deposited in the room they had passed through. As they worked, exhaustion began to set in, and concerns about the stability of the cave walls started to grow. The ceiling above the lead they were working on was made of unstable limestone, and it didn't take long before they realized it might not be safe to continue. Deciding to call it a day, they began packing up their tools. Bob Goforth was the first to exit, making his way back through the crawl space and out of the cave. Mark Pansing was next, climbing up toward the larger room while passing tools ahead of him. As he was working his way out, his shoulder bumped the boulder, and his world suddenly shifted from cautious exploration to sheer terror. The massive rock above him groaned and slid, pinning his head brutally between the unforgiving limestone and the cave wall. His face was smashed against the rough stone, the jagged edges biting into his skin as his helmet strap dug painfully into his throat, restricting his breathing. He could feel the immense pressure building, the boulder threatening to crush him with every second. His mind raced. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe properly, and the weight of the situation was unbearable. Below him, the room was unstable, ready to collapse with one wrong move. Every frantic breath he took scraped his face against the sharp rock, and the panic set in. He tried to loosen his chin strap, but his hands shook uncontrollably and the strap wouldn't budge. His only thought was that any moment, the entire structure could give way, burying not just him, but his companions trapped below. Time seemed to stretch, every second filled with the fear of suffocation or collapse. Just as the panic seemed overwhelming, he called out to Mike Van Note, who was still in the crawlway below. Van Note hurried to him, finding Pansing trapped, his face pressed painfully against the rock and his footing unstable. When he reached him, he saw that Pansing was struggling to free himself while trying to prevent the unstable boulder from crashing down and endangering everyone below. Pansing's chin strap was keeping him stuck and strangling his throat. Despite his efforts to undo it, it wouldn't release. Pansing asked for a knife to cut the strap, and as Van Note passed it up, the situation suddenly shifted. With a loud crack, the boulder shifted again, freeing Pansing's head, but sending a cascade of mud and debris tumbling down into the room below. Rocks clattered and splashed into the wet mud as Van Note scrambled back to avoid the falling debris. Thankfully, the massive boulder didn't fall completely. It wedged itself into the chimney above them, creating a precarious but stable position. For a tense moment, they held their breath, waiting to see if the entire structure would collapse. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the remaining cavers knew they couldn't move the boulder on their own. For 20 minutes, they waited, hoping Goforth, who had exited earlier, would return. Fortunately, Goforth re-entered the cave to check on them after noticing their delay. When he learned they were trapped, they carefully passed him a crowbar from below. With the boulder now wedged in place, Bob Goforth wasted no time. Armed with the crowbar, he began carefully widening the narrow chimney, his every move deliberate and precise. The cavers below could hear the scraping of metal against rock as Goforth worked to create enough space to dislodge the looming boulder. Mud and small rocks occasionally trickled down, raising the tension even further. Mike Van Note kept his eyes on the ceiling, ready to shout a warning if the unstable rock shifted again. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Goforth managed to leverage the boulder into a more stable position. The rock shifted slightly, sending another wave of mud cascading into the room. But this time, it held. The three trapped cavers exchanged relieved glances, their ordeal nearly over. One by one, they carefully climbed up the now wider chimney, each move calculated to avoid disturbing the boulder any further. The climb felt slow, their bodies tired and covered in mud, but as they emerged into the larger room, the sense of relief was palpable. they had escaped what could have been a fatal disaster. This last story involves a 26-year-old graduate who completely disregarded all the fundamental rules of caving. David Roesler's story is a classic case of ignoring common sense and putting himself in a life-threatening situation due to poor judgment. Armed with no prior caving experience, David ventured into a notoriously tricky cave alone. Anyone with basic knowledge of cave exploration knows that the last thing you do is enter a hazardous environment without proper preparation or experience. Yet, that's exactly what he did. On the afternoon of February 11th, 2011, 26-year-old undergraduate David Roesler set out with a friend to explore the Stay High Cave in Virginia. The cave, notorious among local cavers for its treacherous entrance, requires those who enter to stay high, or position themselves on the upper part of a narrow V-shaped passage. By keeping their bodies elevated and carefully moving along the wider parts of the passage, cavers avoid the risk of getting stuck in the narrow crevices below. But for someone like David, who had no training or background in cave exploration, the subtle but crucial techniques necessary for navigating such a cave were lost. From the outset, David's lack of preparation showed. Despite understanding the basic requirement of staying high, he misjudged the danger. As he inched his way deeper into the cave, he gradually slipped toward the narrowest part of the V-shaped passage. The slick walls offered no grip, and before he could react, he was sliding uncontrollably downward. His body shot into the tightest part of the cave, where the rock walls closed in on him, compressing him into a space so tight that every breath became a struggle. As soon as he came to a stop, wedged painfully in the rock, panic set in. His arms were pinned against his sides, and every attempt to free himself made his situation worse. The jagged rocks dug into his skin, and the pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe. His leg was twisted at an awkward angle, adding a new layer of searing pain to his already desperate state. It felt as though the cave itself was squeezing the life out of him, and no matter how hard he tried to push himself up or twist free, the unforgiving rock wouldn't budge. Hours began to pass, and as his body remained locked in place, the pain intensified. The blood flow to his trapped leg began to slow, causing it to swell painfully. The pressure became unbearable. Every slight movement sent shocks of agony shooting up his leg and into his lower back as the rock dug deeper into his body. His muscles ached from the tension, and the cold, seeping through the walls of the cave, began to turn his pain into a deep, bone-chilling ache. At first, David's frustration kept him trying, kept him believing he could somehow break free. But soon, his initial anger turned into helplessness as his strength waned. His breathing became labored, not just from the tightness of the space, but from the growing realization that he might not make it out. His friend, hearing his distant cries for help from outside the cave, ran for assistance. But by the time rescuers arrived, David had already been trapped for what felt like an eternity. When the Newport Rescue Squad arrived, they quickly realized how critical the situation was. David wasn't just stuck. He was being crushed by the very cave itself. Despite their best efforts to pull him out, the rescuers found that each attempt only worsened his condition. His body was wedged so tightly that they couldn't free him without risking further injury. Desperation began to mount as the hours ticked by and the temperature continued to drop. By now, David's body was betraying him. His leg, twisted and crushed under his own weight, began to go numb. At first, it seemed like a blessing, as the sharp pain dulled into a strange, throbbing sensation. But as the numbness spread, David knew that the situation was becoming more dangerous. His circulation was compromised, and the lack of blood flow meant that hypothermia was becoming a real threat. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, chipping away at the rock to widen the passage around him. They brought in specialized tools and even debated the drastic measure of breaking David's hips just to maneuver him out of the crushing gap. But each inch of progress was agonizingly slow, and every time they tried to lift him, the pain surged through his body like fire. His leg was a constant source of agony. Trapped at an unnatural angle, every shift in position sent waves of unbearable pain coursing through him. The cold, too, was taking its toll. As the rescuers struggled to free him, they worried about how long David could hold on. Inside the cave, temperatures had dropped to dangerous levels, and the rescuers worked to keep him warm. They stuffed heat packs into his clothing and even used a hairdryer to blow warm air onto his body. But despite their best efforts, the cold air gnawed at his limbs, and David's strength was fading fast. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and he began slipping in and out of consciousness as the pain and exhaustion overwhelmed him. As the night wore on, David's reality became a haze of cold and pain. He could feel himself drifting, his body too exhausted to fight anymore. Every breath was a battle against the crushing pressure on his chest, and his leg felt like it was being torn apart from the inside. He tried to focus, to hold on for the rescuers, but his mind kept slipping into a dark, numb fog. But the rescuers refused to give up. They chipped away at the bedrock around him, hoisting his broken body upward little by little. Finally, after nearly 12 hours of grueling effort, David was freed. His body was limp as they pulled him from the cave, his skin pale from the cold, and his leg badly injured from the crush. He was immediately flown to Montgomery Regional Hospital, where doctors worked to treat his hypothermia and the severe crush injury that had nearly claimed his leg. David's survival was a miracle, but the pain he endured was beyond anything most people can imagine.